All right, so we're going to get started. My name's Nick. I'm the coordinator here at Illuminé, so I help put these events together. What is Illuminé exactly? Well, we meet every Friday. We're a campus ministry group, and we have weekly Bible studies and socials, so people will come and get a free home-cooked dinner, and then we'll have about an hour-long Bible study, and then people stay as long as they want. Sometimes they leave early. Sometimes people stay quite late. So anyways, it's a lot of fun. Tonight we have a very special guest, Dr. Mike Berg. He has his Master's of Divinity from Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, a Doctorate of Ministry from Biola University at La Miranda, California. He studied International Academy of Apologetics, Evangelism, and Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, and is professor of theology at the Wisconsin Lutheran College, and is co-host of Let the Bird Fly, a popular podcast on living freely in a world given back to us. He is also co-director of the Black Earth Apologetics, a summer apologetics program in Wisconsin. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. Berg.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. Apparently you don't get a meal tonight, though. So that's, sorry about that. I like to start with an American phrase, if that's okay. I'm going to apologize before I do this, but it's a phrase probably many of you have heard and probably even thought about. That in the founding documents of the United States, we have this phrase called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You have certainly heard about this, and there was actually a debate early on about that last word, happiness. In fact, in some places it says life, liberty, and property. Everybody has the right to life, liberty, and property. And this wasn't some kind of proto-capitalistic money grab materialism. To own property back then meant that you could vote, right? It meant that you had a place in society, that you could participate in this kind of new society that was coming up. And so what did they mean by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? If we kind of look a little bit deeper, we understand that there's a problem with the word happiness in the way we think about it today. It seems to be a very curved inward thing. It's a feeling. I feel happy, but that's not what the founding forefathers meant when they said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were classically trained, and they understood that there was this Greek concept called Eudaimonia or Eudaimonia. That's pronounced in many different ways. It literally means good demon, but that's kind of beside the point. And it's often translated into English as happiness. But I think that it means so much more than just a personal feeling. It meant the highest good. It was the answer to the question, what is the best life? How shall I live? All of these deep philosophical questions that many people have asked. Happiness, eudaimonia, I think there's good reason to translate it not as happiness, but as human flourishing. As human flourishing. And so when the founding forefathers of the United States, at least, and I think we could say really all of Western civilization would think this way at its best, would say, you have the right to go out and homestead, to participate in civic society, to build institutions like schools, and do research at universities and museums and art, and study architecture and build churches, all of these kinds of things. It meant kind of a full life, but somehow along the way, we English speakers especially started to think about happiness as a curved inward thing. It became something like a personal euphoria. There's a problem with that, by the way. You don't ever quite feel happy in the present. Philosophers have thought about this. It's very difficult to stop and ask yourself, are you happy? In fact, if I asked you right now, are you happy right now at this moment? You may go, well, I think so, but then you start thinking about, I think there's a virus going around, and then there is going to be some crazy elections in the United States, and the hockey season's not anymore, and the NBA's been canceled. Maybe I'm not happy. Happiness is one of those things that you either look back upon or you look forward to. I'm just old enough, and my children are old enough now that I spoil the youngest, and I cognitively know that I'm doing it and I know that I'm wrong. In fact, sometimes I'm just kind of rough on her to balance it out. And I know that I'm wrong, but I feel it slipping away. My youth and her youth. And I go, oh, remember when they were just little kids running around? That's when I was happy. But I'm not old enough to have forgotten that's exactly not what I was thinking back then. Back then I was thinking, once they get out of diapers, once we make a little bit more money, once they can just feed themselves, my goodness, once they could just take care of themselves, then we'll be happy. So happiness, if it's just going to be a personal feeling, a personal euphoria, boy, that's hard. That's hard. And it's certainly not what the Greeks and the American forefathers, at least, they understood at it. May I suggest that the Greek concept, Eudaimonia or Eudaimonia, this happiness or the good life, the highest good, human flourishing, was the Greek attempt at the Hebrew concept, Shalom. And just like Eudaimonia is translated into English with one word, typically happiness, and it just doesn't quite, there's a little bit something more. Shalom has a one-word translation into English. It's better than happiness, but it's not quite there. It's peace. I mean, shalom and peace, you know probably that both can be greetings. Shalom, peace to you, that kind of thing. But the Hebrew word and concept shalom never meant an inward kind of peace. Nothing wrong with that, but it was more of an outward kind of thing. Think about not just peace, but peacetime versus wartime. So shalom is not just, hey, these two countries aren't fighting anymore. It's a cessation of armed conflict. It's the meaning between peacetime and wartime. So in wartime, you spend 3 hours in line at the grocery store to buy a loaf of bread for $50 because the economy is in ruins. And you're afraid to send your children out to school even if there is a school because you don't know if there's going to be sniper fire on that street. Wartime is when certain institutions have closed down, like schools, like museums, sports and leisure, these kinds of things. But peacetime, on the other hand, is when the economy is rolling a little bit. And we're researching. And we got time enough to do stuff like this, and for sports and entertainment and all that kind of stuff. At its core, shalom means wholeness, completeness, this kind of thing. But I wonder if we could translate it this way, that shalom is the way it's supposed to be. It's the way it's supposed to be. And if you allow me to be theological just for a second, sin is then the opposite of shalom, the way it's not supposed to be. Peacetime versus wartime. Even if you've never read the Bible or anything like that, probably you at least sort of are familiar with the history around Israel, especially Judah, the Jewish people, that they were carried off into exile in about 586 years before Christ by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar. You've probably at least heard of that name. There was a prophet named Jeremiah from the Jewish people, who told the people who were literally being carried off into a foreign land, that prophet said, I want you to work for the shalom of the city you're going to be in. And what he meant was, plant your vineyards, have your families, start businesses, build homes, work for the shalom of those around you and for the shalom of yourself. And the context of that was, God will bring you back to this promised land. Don't worry, we got it covered. But the word shalom there is something more than just peace, right? It's something more. And I think human flourishing would be, at least in some circumstances, a good translation of both shalom and eudaimonia, and this pursuit of happiness thing that we got rattling around, at least in the brains of current Americans. So what do we mean then by shalom or wholeness, the way it's supposed to be? I would suggest that there are 4 components. You could probably come up with 4 too, but I would think that security, prosperity, freedom, and purpose are things that are unique or 4 components of shalom, human flourishing. Seems very hard for me to see somebody flourishing if they don't have at least a little bit of security, right? Like, it's hard for me to say, oh, I'm going to do something when I'm afraid to go out of my house because there may be a suicide bomber, right? And I think there's a certain amount of prosperity that is necessary for human flourishing. I'm not talking about being rich here. I'm just saying if my whole day is just trying to scrounge up enough food so that my family doesn't starve, that's not exactly what we would call human flourishing, the best life, the good life, the highest good. I think it's very hard to flourish if you're in prison, and so there would be freedom as well. And those first three, we can maybe have an overarching thing called justice. Justice is it's a funny word and maybe sometimes a controversial word in our contemporary way of thinking, but justice, I think, is right. Just, right, the way it's supposed to be. And so if there are economic policies, and I don't want to push this maybe too far, but if there are housing policies that are unfair, then a segment of our population does not flourish. And we want something better. And we strive for something better, all of us. But that fourth component is the one probably I would think about more tonight than the other three, and that would be purpose. And so maybe here I'll ask myself the question, why do I need purpose? Why am I driven by this? Why does it make me upset when I'm not living up to a certain potential and when other people around me aren't living up to that potential? Or let's put it this way, what makes me different than the squirrel? I got squirrels and chipmunks in my yard right now. They are on my last nerve. The squirrels, the oak trees have dropped a bunch. Every 3 years they drop a bunch of whatever nuts they have. And the squirrels don't know what to do with it. The squirrels are super fat right now because they have too much food. And they're digging into my yard and in where I have put new plants. The chipmunks are digging at my foundation. They have no regard for me whatsoever. I have even trapped chipmunks and humanely take them to a place where I let them out. I'm not supposed to do that, I don't think. But it doesn't matter. They just keep coming back. And I'm battling them and I'm losing. And it strikes me as weird that why are we doing this? Why don't the squirrels don't say to themselves, we should form a union. And we should give these demands, because I've gone to the point where I had bought coyote urine and spread it around my yard to keep, I've been reduced by vermin to buying coyote urine. And why don't they form a union and come up to me and why don't they say, let's form a union and let's say to this bourgeoisie homeowner that here are our demands. No more coyote urine, right? No more trapping the chipmunks. We'll make a deal with you that if you just build us a box where we can put our nuts, then we won't dig up your yard. Why don't the squirrels do that? Why don't the chipmunks say we should build condominiums? Why don't they lie out in the yard in the middle of the night and look into the night sky and say, I wonder what it would be like to go to the moon? Why do the squirrels not do that, but why do we do that? Why do we look at somebody who just lives a subsistence kind of living? They just survive. And we look at that and we say that's tragic, whether it's their fault or somebody else's fault or mental disease or whatever. Why do we say that's tragic when the squirrel doesn't say that to another squirrel? What is it about us that is driven to do such great things? I would argue that at least part of this puzzle, and I think a very important one, at least from my point of view, is that we're created in the image of God. And therefore, we are made for epicness, that we are made for greatness. And I'm going to say this, and you all are going to think about somebody in your life. I think that we're made for drama, and if we don't have drama in our life, real drama, we'll make it up. We'll make it up. Because we see ourselves as important, and we want to be seen as important. Right? And so we will take whatever it is that is in our life, good, bad, or ugly, and we will make it a very important thing. We will be overwhelmed with it. We are made for something great. And so I don't know about you, but I find myself bouncing between contentment and discontentment. Like I'm content, like I'm not living on the streets. Like I got a good education. I'm fairly mentally stable. You know? I mean, I got a good family, a good wife, I got a good job. I should be content. In fact, my God in my scriptures say, be content. You're blessed. But then I have this other point where I say, how could I ever be content? How could I ever be content with a life that is surrounded by injustice? How could I ever be content with the wrongness, just the utter, terrible, heinous acts that I see on the news every single night? I'm sorry, but I am not content with this. And I think our discontent often is very righteous. We should be discontent with injustice, discontent with problems in our lives. I would maybe even urge you, because I would imagine you all have felt this, the anger that you have when something is unfair or unjust, whether it's to you or to the world around you. I would push that a little bit farther and say you should not be content with death itself. You're not supposed to live. We're not supposed to be made for death. I was a pastor for 12 years. I buried a lot of people. And the spectrum went from somebody who was, I think she was probably 98 years old. She had never gone to a hospital. She had her children at home. She was one of those from way back then. She never had a headache. She told me, she's like, Pastor, I've never had a headache. Everybody's talking about having a headache. I never had a headache. She had a good life, 98 years. I buried a baby that lived 45 minutes. I buried some men who had every opportunity for success, but the bottle just took it away from them. And you know how sad it is to go to conduct a funeral with 4 people that show up? I've done that too. And to me it says, this lady over here, what a wonderful thing. I'm so happy for her. And then I look at all these other things and I use the word tragic. But that's on me, because I should call this one over here, where the lady had a full life, 98 years, as just as tragic. Because she wasn't made for death. She was made for life. And I'm rightfully discontent with that, as I am with all the injustice that is around this world. And so why is that? Right? Why is it that we are the types of being that can be discontent with their situation to the point that they form unions? Right? Because we are created in the image of God. We are created for epicness. We are created for greatness, and we know it. In fact, the greatness that you possess is greater than you'll ever know. It's almost infinite. Like if you would look up and say, here's my limit of greatness, believe me, it is beyond that. And I know that. Let me tell you an experience that I had that proved that to me anyway. I'm the oldest of 6 kids, and not really good kids. I mean, we're okay, but, I'm the oldest. And when it came time for me to become a father, there was nothing that I looked forward to that scared me. Well, I shouldn't say that. There was nothing that was going to surprise me. And in fact, being a parent, there is not one thing that has surprised me. But that did not make me confident of being a parent. In fact, it made me petrified, because I knew what kind of love and patience it would take. And I didn't have it in me. But then I held that baby girl in my arms for the first time. And the ceiling of love that I had was blown away. And I realized I had more potential than I thought. When my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, I literally thought this. I'm not proud to say this out loud, but I literally thought this, that I would not like the second kid. And I literally thought that I would not have enough love. Because love does... I got this little 2-year-old with little blonde pigtails, yakking, won't ever shut up. She's yakking, she's cute as can be. I can't take any love from my first child and then give it to my second child. That's not how love works. And I'm tapped out. I got a ceiling. But then I held that second baby girl in my arms, and I knew my potential was even greater. By the time the third daughter came along, I knew what would happen. Now I just want them to shut up and leave me alone. But that's a little bit of a different story. I could have 25 children and I would have enough love. I wouldn't have the money, the patience for them, but I would have the love. Why is it? Because I'm created in the image of God. And that image is lost in this broken world, but I'm something different than the squirrel. And I got potential, but let me also say that I have the potential for great evil. As much as I have the potential for greatness and for love. It was not the tyrants who did the great, awful genocides in our history. It was regular people that carried out this stuff. I got something in me that is bigger than me, and I know it, and I think that you know it as well. I think also that we're something different than the squirrels because, and this is related, that we want to be valued. We are not just Homo sapiens, people who have wisdom, although sometimes I seem to doubt that. But we are also Homo justificans, which I would say is we are the types of beings that are justifiable, seek to be justified, and from a Christian point of view, are justified or are possibly justified by Jesus Christ. Like Jesus is going to justify you. That would be the message of Christianity. Now, justification is a big theological word, but it doesn't have to be that way. Just think about it the way we deal with it everyday life. So let's just say this. You justify stuff all the time. Let's say I come home from work on Monday, and I pull up to my house, and I am pulling behind my Jeep a $50,000 speed bump. And my wife comes out, and now I have to justify my purchase to her. Right? And what do I mean that I have to justify that purchase to her? I have to make it just. Just think right. I got to make this right. I got to prove by talking to her, by giving her reasons, this was the right thing to do. This was the just thing to do. I need to justify my purchase, my actions, and myself to her. Now, I got no hope in that situation. Even if I won the lottery that day, she would still say, and that's the first thing you bought? Right? There's no way I could justify that purchase. So when we think about justification, think about righteousness. Really the same word. I'm trying to make myself look right. Now, may I suggest that if you are honest with yourself, that your whole life is trying to justify yourself to other people and to yourself. You are trying to make yourself look right, valuable, and just, whether you know it or not. So I'm driving to work on Tuesday morning. There's somebody going really slow in the fast lane. And I say to myself, don't you understand that this is the fast lane? It must be nice to have a Sunday afternoon drive, but it's Tuesday morning, and I have places to be. What am I really saying? Don't you understand how important I am? I'm saying to this person who I will have never met and has no access to my inner monologue. Tuesday afternoon, I'm driving home from work. Someone's riding my tail. I think, slow down, buddy. We all got places to be. I'm just as important as you, I'm saying to this person who I will never meet and has no access to my inner monologue. I am trying to say, I'm right. I am just. I am worthy of praise. I am valuable. The squirrel never says to the other squirrel, do I look good in this outfit or not? I think it's why we gossip. Because if I had that little bit of information, I got value in the group. I think it's why we make excuses. I think it's why we give our resume subtly and not so subtly sometimes in conversations. I think it's why 8th grade boys act the way 8th grade boys do, and I know because I was an 8th grade boy. You ever notice that 8th grade boys sometimes pretend like they don't care about math or English or something like that? They don't know it, but this is what's going on in their mind. That if they try at that, they risk failure. And failure is going to be embarrassing. And so maybe they've made this cognitive, they've kind of made the calculation that if I fail at that, well then I can always say, well, I didn't try. I don't care about that. It's also why 8th grade girls inexplicably still want the attention of those 8th grade boys. I think if you admit it, we're always trying to justify our existence and our value. Why is that? Because we were made for something great, for something big, for the best life, for happiness, for human flourishing, for that. So theologically, if you don't mind me doing a little bit of theology here, there is this concept from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, and in other places you'll find this. We call it the two kinds of righteousness, right? So I said justification, righteousness. Think about two systems. System number one is called a righteousness by law. So right by law. The other system is a righteousness by faith. So the righteousness by law is generally how the world works. So I'm right, I'm valuable, I'm justified, my existence is justified by law. I do this, and then I either get rewarded or punished. So you don't study, you're going to get a bad grade. If you break the law, generally speaking, obviously there's some exceptions, you are not going to, you're not going to have a very good life. But this is terrible when it comes to love. There's no mechanism for forgiveness, is there? So think about it this way. So I bring my child home from the hospital, right, after she is being born. I got a little car seat right there. And we go into the house, and I put the car seat down on the porch, and I say to her, I hope one day that you can agree to follow the rules of this house. Then I will love you, and I will reward you with food and protection and clothing. Let me know when you're ready to make a decision. And then I close the front door. This would be awful, right? So a righteousness of value, love, all that kind of, based only on law, seems to be a dead end for us. Now, beyond that theologically, I would argue that in the Christian scriptures they would say, that they say, you need to be perfect. Like the standard's perfection. The standard is being perfect like your Heavenly Father is perfect. And so there's no way that I can be right. We call it justification too, according to this law, because who could keep the law? So this is where we have a righteousness by faith over here. And the Christian message is there is a righteousness that is alien to you. It's outside of you. Jesus is righteous. Like he came down here and he did everything perfectly that you could not do perfectly. And that righteousness is then given to your account. And so you are made righteous on account of what somebody else did. He loved you anyway. He justified you. He made you just. He made you right. He gave you everything you needed, even if you didn't deserve it. Not a righteousness by law, but rather a righteousness by faith. Now, we can maybe put that aside a little bit, and may I suggest that if you live in this righteousness by law, which is our default position, whether you know about what I just said about St. Paul and Jesus and all that stuff, I think you can feel that. Like, I'm willing to bet that none of you are ever satisfied. I tell you right now that if I won 30 Nobel Prizes in a row, like every year, one in chemistry, then one in the, I am the guy from the Dos Equis commercial, right? The most interesting man that has ever lived, right? If I won 30 in a row, you want to know what I'd want? 31. And if I made $1 million, you want to know what I'd want to make? $10 million? And I bet you're the same too. That you're never quite satisfied with the mere adulations of other human beings. Like you'll never ever be satisfied. Why is that? Well, I think that we were made for something greater than this place. I think we were made for something fantastic. And notice how many of us are trying to find that justification, that righteousness, that value in all of the wrong places. I know it's a little cliche to say social media, but I'm sure that's part of the psychology of a lot of people. That it's a promotion, that it's the highest salary, that it's the PhD, that it's whatever it is that your goal is. If its only purpose is to satisfy your desire for greatness, I'm afraid that when you get there, you're going to say, this is it. And you're going to want more. Which is kind of okay because we keep striving, don't we? We're never satisfied, you know. I'm kind of glad there are people like that because they're the ones who invent things and whatever. But the psychology of that can be very troubling. This goes to the heart of self-esteem, I would argue, as well. Now let me do something more theological again, if you don't mind. There is this doctrine in the Christian church, particularly the Lutheran church, called the doctrine of vocation. So vocation is like a calling. So I have a calling, right? There's someone who has called me to something greater than just me. And in the Christian faith, we think about there's a caller that calls somebody, but there's always a neighbor. And so the goal really is the neighbor. It goes from God through the person to the neighbor. Now, when this thing became, let's not say popular, but when this idea of vocation really grabbed on and people were really thinking about it, was at the Reformation. So again, even if you've never even delved into Christianity at all, just from history, you know that there was this thing that happened in Europe called the Reformation, right about the time of the Renaissance, and kind of changed the world, right? There was an Augustinian friar, his name was Martin Luther, and he had this idea that he needed to be righteous by law, right? He was in this system over here. And so his whole life, his time, his energy, all of his actions were in an ethical orientation that was vertical. It was from him to God. I do something and then God loves me. I work really hard and then Daddy's happy with me. Get what I'm saying? Right? I'm living to please the Heavenly Father. Hopefully he doesn't beat me. Right? You can imagine being a child in that kind of household where you're only working for the father's approval or the parents' approval. So his ethical orientation was vertical, but then he actually read what St. Paul said about these two kinds of righteousness, and he realized, I can't make God happy because because the standard's perfection, right? And I can try to justify myself, there's that word again. I can try to make myself righteous by making excuses. Like, if you had given me a better wife, God, then I wouldn't have had to cheat on her. Right? This didn't work in kindergarten, it's not going to work before God, and it's certainly not going to work in our courtrooms either, right? It's just a ridiculous thing how we are trying to justify ourselves. So once he realized he couldn't do that, and better yet, he didn't have to, because Jesus was righteous in his place, now what's a monk to do with all his time and his energy? If the ethical orientation is no longer vertical, then it's going to be horizontal. And so now he finally realized that all my time and energy was not meant to make God happy, but to love neighbor. To love neighbor. So we call this vocation where the love of God goes through the Christian and then goes to the neighbor. And who cares about, don't worry about God. Don't worry about making God happy. You don't have to even think about that, right? This is how then it would flow. There is an ethical reorientation that occurs from vertical to horizontal. Now, let's play this with this just a little bit. Just a couple more things about that doctrine of vocation, and let's try to put it together with purpose. So one way we think about this is God puts on a mask. So like a Halloween mask, right? And God hides behind quite a few masks in the world. Now, why does he hide behind masks? I would argue that if it's true that God is this all-powerful, all-glorious kind of being, and stay with me even if you haven't thought about that way, that means that a puny little me, can't come into the glory of God. Right? Kind of like if you've ever watched Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant, right? You just would be blown away by the glory of God. So God hides in order to be intimate with his creation. Now, I'm not. Let me say something with risk of maybe offending some of you. Christianity is different than other religions, and I'm not bagging on other religions. I'm just saying they're different, right? In three ways, Christianity seems to be different. Again, I'm not necessarily saying better or worse. I'm just saying that they're different. Reason number one is that in every other philosophy or religion, it's a righteousness by law. There's something I have to do in some shape, way, or form to make God happy. That's kind of how it works. But in Christianity, it's tried to flip upside down, that it is God who comes down, and he's the one that does the work. And that brings us kind of to the second thing, is that it's a claim on reality. So in most religions, they're not really concerned about, okay, did the events actually occur? This is just an overarching story. This gives us a morality, a thing to explain the beginning, the middle, and the end kind of thing. We're not really concerned about, did these stories actually happen? They're just stories. But Christianity is saying, Jesus really did this kind of thing. And then the third one is that an all-powerful sovereign God is a gritty, get into the mud and the blood and the beer kind of God. And the way he does that is he puts on masks so that he can be intimate with his creation. And so it goes like this. Could God just give us, theoretically, could God just say, poof, here's food for dinner, and it just appeared? Theoretically, we could say, okay, yes. But he doesn't do that. Rather, he works behind the masks of farmer, truck driver, the inspector who looks at the food, the grocer, the person who made it, all of these kinds of things, so that he's close to you. So I never have to say, where is God in my life? He's hiding behind all these people. He's hiding behind all those people. Many of them, I'm sure, grew up in at least somewhat of a religious kind of situation where maybe you prayed before you ate a meal. At least you know what that is about, right? So have you ever wondered, why do people pray to God for that meal when Grandma made it? Isn't that insulting to Grandma? You're like, I'm going to thank God for this meal. And Grandma's like, what the heck, I'm the one that did it, right? And maybe after the meal, you're like, oh, thank you, Grandma. So what gives? Is it Grandma or God? Well, we solve that by saying it's God through Grandma. So don't just think about that. I'll just talk about my marriage. So God would like my wife, Amanda, to be loved and adored and encouraged and all of these things. And he chose me to do it. So it's really about God and my wife, and I happen to be a part of the equation. And by the way, vice versa. So here I am, a person who is driven to greatness. I cannot accept anything else but greatness, and I'm discontent in a world that is not perfect, right? And I need to do something great because I'm something different than the squirrel. And then he says, I will give you something divine to do. You will be a part of the divine equation that is the love that I have for my wife, or that for my children, for my students, for whatever it is. The closest thing I can think about it is if you would approach let's say a Canadian soldier in the dress uniform, you know what I'm talking about, the dress uniform. And you got nothing better to say. And no matter what your politics, you at least respect that person. And you go up to him or her and you say something like, Thank you for your service. That's all you can come up with. Right? That's what we say. They've heard it a million times. And if that soldier's having a good day, he or she may respond this way. It wasn't about me. In fact, it was a privilege to be a part of something bigger. That bigger being the cause of protecting the freedom of Canadians all over the world. Right? Despite your politics, whatever they may be, we can all agree with that. Right? That's the closest thing I can get to with this doctrine of vocation, where you say, this was not about me. And you may think that makes you small, that it makes the soldier small and insignificant, a cog in a machine or just a number. But that's not what that soldier said. The soldier said, even though I'm small, I'm lifted to a startling degree, something higher than just myself. Like even if I would go my whole way, it wouldn't be enough because I'm made for drama. And so I am lifted into something higher than me as an individual. And it's a privilege. It's a privilege to serve. So I think about that way with my marriage, with my family, with my job, whatever it is, that it's a privilege to be a part of this divine equation. It's something beyond me, and it scratches that itch that I got for greatness. And I'm never quite satisfied unless I had the biggest, baddest job, and even then, even if I made all the money in the world, and even if I had 30 Nobel Prizes in a row, I would still want 31. This scratches that itch. It's almost as if I was made for this. I was made for something bigger, and then I am given that thing that is something bigger. So, what does that mean for us in our everyday life? I think it means that we start looking, at our importance and our value. And it has to be based on something more than money, looks, prestige, privilege, what kind of job we got. Those are all dead ends. Those are all dead ends. Instead of saying, wherever I am in my life, I ask myself, who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor in this situation? And then I serve that neighbor in the best way I can. Not because I'm trying to please God. Nope, don't have to do that. Doesn't matter. Not because I'm trying to find some satisfaction. That's never going to happen. But because this is a fellow human being. And God has lifted me up to a startling degree to be a part of something in his economy of love. So we call it a Christological endeavor. So again, let me do one more theology thing with you. That when we've already talked about when God hides behind the mask. So I am fed. It is the person who feeds me is Christ hiding behind the mask of that person. And so that person is elevated very highly, but it's really Christ who feeds me. So when somebody comes and brings me dinner, I say, thank you, God, and thank you to the person. But there's something else that Jesus said. He also said, and he's talking about when he confronts people on in Judgment Day, and he says, to those who have been faithful, he says, you visited me when I was in prison, and you fed me when I was hungry, and you clothed me when I was naked. And the faithful say to Jesus in this last day of judgment scene, they say, when did we ever see you in prison? When were you ever naked? I mean, what are you talking about? And Jesus says, whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. So when I am being fed by someone, that is Christ feeding me. But from that person's point of view, when they feed me, they are feeding Christ as well. Because whatever they did for the least of these brothers of mine, they did for Christ. So vocation then is a Christological endeavor. I am Christ to you, and you are Christ to me. Can you see how that completely changes your attitude from day to day? Do you see how that completely changes human rights? Right? And how this completely changes how we look at other people? So that the businessman looks and says, I am serving Christ. I'm not trying to just run a business and have clients and customers to sell something. I'm serving Christ. Right? So it kind of changes everything when we think about that. I kind of hinted at the idea of being curved inward or being curved outward. That original idea of the pursuit of happiness, if it is only a personal euphoria, if it's only a feeling, I feel happy. I've already said it's kind of a hard thing to put your finger on, but it's also a very curved inward kind of thing. We call it in the theology world navel gazing. There's constantly looking at your belly button, your navel. You're always kind of hunched over like this. And I would suggest that you're never going to be satisfied because sometimes you look in and you're like, I don't like what I see. But if you're curved outward, think about your shoulders being back now. Your posture's back. And you tend to see three things. I would suggest from a Christian point of view, the first thing you see is Christ. You say, that's my righteousness. That's why I'm valued. That God Almighty came down here and loved me. So I don't care if I'm Mr. Popular or not, or if I get the promotion at my job or not. I am valued because of what he does. The second thing I see is my neighbor for the very first time. So if my ethical orientation is always this way to God, or if it's only within myself, either way I don't see my neighbor. And my neighbor becomes something that I use. Either I use them so that I can sell something to them, right, in this business kind of thing, or they're there for my happiness, or maybe even I want to do good works through them so that God loves me. Either way, I use them. But when I'm lifted up and I'm free from trying to please anybody, I now see my neighbor for the very first time, and I see Christ in them, and I see objects of love. And the third thing that I see when I am curved outward is I see a world given back to me. So this world is for me to enjoy, not to abuse, but to love and to enjoy. Like I don't have to sit there and say, I can't enjoy that. I can only eat kale because otherwise I'm going to get out of shape and then I won't be popular. Or I don't have time to go on vacation because I got this a pathway to a better job, right? I got to work hard so that I can live up to the family name or make a lot of money or whatever. And I tend not to see the world as a gift that has been given to me, but it is something that I need to stay away from, or something that I have to use so that I can get to that point of greatness, so that I can get to that point of a higher importance, an epicness that I know that I was made for. So we flip it all upside down and we say, God has made us for greatness, and then he lifts us up into this greatness. I think that is a fulfilled way of looking at this desire we have, this human flourishing, this happiness, this Eudaimonia, this Shalom, if you want. So we'll close with maybe you have a few chances for a few minutes for discussion or questions, but if some of you have to leave, that's fine too. I would just say Shalom to you, human flourishing to you and to everyone you meet. And what a great opportunity we have, having been freed from trying to please God, to go forward and being lifted up into his economy of love. And maybe one last thought. When you're free from trying to please other people, that idea of justifying your existence and finding value in other people's opinions of you, that's when you're free to actually lose yourself into the craft of your job. So wherever you find yourself, I don't care what it is, you can find craft in that job. And you know that job is important even if nobody else does. Here's a silly example. Not everybody gets to be prime minister. Not everybody gets to be a senator or representative working here in Ottawa, right? Somebody's got to clean the bathroom. We somehow, in our twisted way of thinking, have said prime minister, senator, pop star, center for the Maple Leafs, senator and prime minister, bus driver, janitor, something like that. But God sees them all this way because they're all doing his work. Like God wants things clean. Of course he does. And by the way, if nobody cleans anything, who cares if everybody's a senator? Because disease is running rampant, right? So it's just as important to God, this bill that's going through right now, whatever, in whatever state house or whatever, and the person who is cleaning the bathroom, those are equally important in God's eyes. And so if I'm over here and maybe I don't get the salary that I deserve, and maybe I don't get the recognition I deserve from everybody else, when I go into that bathroom, I can still think this is a craft that I do, and it's important. And maybe it's only God and I who know that this is important. But so what? But so what? Those adulations, those promotions, and those things I pine after, they were never going to be enough anyway, because I was made for something even bigger, because I'm something different than this world. So if we think about it that way, I think that we can have a better chance at shalom here this side of heaven. All right, so I'll just open it up to any comments or questions from anybody in our last maybe 10 minutes here. Yes?
I actually have two questions.
Sure.
My first was kind of unrelated. It's just, are you first doctor or pastor?
First pastor and always pastor.
Okay. Just curious. My second question is, you said that, through other people, or, you get your meal through someone, but, God is the one who, through this person, made this meal.
Mm-hmm.
That works really well, or, I see it very well for, good things.
Mm-hmm.
It's more for, difficulties or bad things. How
Sure.
would that be justified?
Yeah. So the first thing to remember is we're going to screw it up, right? I'm going to screw it up. Like I said, this is God's love for my wife. By the time it gets to my wife, it's not so great, right? So we call that sinning against vocation. So, that's a theological word, but when I mess up in my job, people get hurt. The ethical orientation is not right. The ethical orientation, that's kind of sobering, right? So with that said, though, there are certain callings or vocations that would be fake vocations. We're talking theologically here, so it's not like God said, I called that person to be a loan shark, right? So the deeper question, however, is, and I wish we had more time for this, but the deeper question is, how can there be evil? Where does evil come from? All of these kinds of questions, right? That's a bigger topic, and I'd be happy to answer that, but in this context of vocation, let me say this. That if I'm working in a sinful world, so a broken world, if you will, and I'm God's co-worker, he puts me on as a mask, and he suffered in love for other people, then I should expect that I would suffer for other people too. So much of my suffering is seen through the lens of love for other people, right? So I should expect to be spit upon, because I'm working with Christ, and that's exactly how people treated him that way. Now, if your question is, how come there's bad stuff in the world just in general, right? One way to think about that in the terms of what I've just been saying is, if God's going to use people, and you ask, well, why is there bad stuff in the world? Look what he's got to deal with. You know what I mean? This is what he's working with, right? We're broken people, and he's working with broken people, so we should expect brokenness. But at the same time, we have this, we know, we just the fact that we know that we're broken says something, that there is wholeness, shalom, that is out there. And then to see that little bits of shalom work through us really is kind of uplifting, and it gives us hope for something better. So I dodged your question a little bit. But the bigger question about, why is there evil? Well, because we're evil. And God allowed a certain amount of free will for us to make decisions and the ramifications for that, for those sins. I would suggest, however, that finally God is in charge of evil. So I'm just going to do it, Luke, if that's okay. You got 4 options, I think. Why is there evil in the world? How could there be a God who is all-loving and powerful, as I'm claiming, and evil in the world? Option number 1, God's not powerful enough to stop evil. Good luck. Option number 2 is, even worse, God doesn't care enough to stop evil. Good luck. Option number 3 is, there is no God. Good luck. The 4th option is, God is in charge of evil. It's a hard one to wrap our heads around. Think about it this way. If the goal, and I'm saying this is the goal of the Christian faith, is to get out of the system of a theology or a righteousness by law, to think that you can do it like you can please God. Like, don't do that. Like, you can't do that. And if you say, I want to be judged for my law, for my life according to the law, then you're going to be judged according to the law, and that's bad news for all of us. As we say in the Wisconsin Lutheran College to our students, remember, if it's an all-knowing God, he also has your browser history. Got it? You don't want to be judged by this law. So the goal is that you are judged not by what you have done, but what Jesus did in your place. So there is justice. Jesus pays for the price of the sins of the world, but in exchange, you look righteous and are made righteous. Now, if this is my default position, a righteousness by law, it seems to me that God maybe has to smack me on the back of the head once in a while to remind me that I'm not all that. It's good for us to be embarrassed sometimes, isn't it? It's good for us to be a little bit kind of shamed, maybe, a little bit. And we go, okay, maybe I'm not that great, maybe I have to work harder. In this situation, okay, I'm not that great. I need to be saved from an outside source. So if the goal is that you're in this righteousness by faith and not a righteousness by law, it seems to me that once in a while bad things that remind me I'm not all that are actually good things. So they may be evil, and they are evil, but God is in charge of that evil and uses it for good. I could say more on that, but let's see if there's anybody else that wants to bring up a question about flourishing or shalom or anything like that. Can I tell you about Job then?
Yes.
All right. You guys know Job? The story in the Old Testament? Rich guy, everything's going well. He's got a big family. He's got a lot of cattle. He's got a lot of money. He's got a good reputation. And we're told in the book of Job, which is the Old Testament, and we're told in the first chapter that the devil, Satan, comes by and God said, and kind of, it almost seems to like kind of taunt God a little bit. We're not told that, but like it says, nobody likes you. The world's full of a bunch of jerks and nobody likes you. And God says to the devil, but have you considered my servant Job? He likes me. He's a faithful, righteous man. And the devil seems to say, of course he likes you. Look at all the money, the cattle, the friends, all of this kind of stuff. If you let me at him, he will curse you and die. And this is the most fascinating part of the book. God says, go ahead. But he says you cannot take his life. So here is God saying to Satan, you can go, you can have him. So, Job's health is taken away, his wealth is taken away, his family is taken away. But in the end, Job does not curse God, and in fact, rather, his faith is stronger. Because now he can't trust in himself. He has to trust God. That's the whole idea, a righteousness by faith, by trust. And I think the devil knew that. So now let's just say, I'm not saying this for sure, but let's just, for argument's sake, say that the devil and God have a monthly staff meeting. So they get together. And the devil comes and says, nobody likes you, the whole world, look at how crazy they are, they don't trust you at all. And he says, but what about my people here in Ottawa? They love me. And the devil says, well, of course they do. Look at that beautiful city. They have this privilege of going to a great university. They all got cars, they got bikes, of course they do. Let me at them, and they will curse you and die. And God has a list of all of you, and he says, okay, but don't touch her checkbook. Okay for him, but no cancer for him. And he just goes down the list and gives permission for the devil to come after you, knowing full well that will make your faith stronger. I don't know if that happens, but if it is God is in charge of evil, it's actually quite a comforting thing. By the way, I've always thought about the devil as the perpetual buyer of lottery. Do you have a lottery? I'm sure you have. Do you have a lottery in Canada? Yeah. I shouldn't assume that. He's a perpetual buyer of lottery tickets. Like he knows this is not going to work. But he can't help himself. Because you are so valuable to him. And I suppose theoretically there's always a couple winners. But more often than not, the suffering that comes your way, as painful as it may be, and as many doubts as it may produce, in the end, made faith stronger. So this is kind of a game changer when you think about it, though, because you have a theology of suffering here that really no other philosophy really has a good handle on. Right, when I was talking about the idea of being turned inward in this feeling of happiness, that's basically hedonism. Hedonism is another word that gets kind of a bad rap in modern day English. We think about it like sexual debauchery or whatever. But hedonism does not really mean that. It means the more what give us the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. Pain has no meaning in this way of thinking. It's just bad. It's something to be eradicated by a therapy or by a pill or whatever. But if pain has no meaning in life, that means half of life doesn't have meaning, and that's in Ottawa in 2020, let alone a third world country 100 years ago. So you have to have some sort of philosophy, theology, something that gives meaning to suffering and pain. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to put together the pieces of this life. And I would suggest the story of Job helps us out. And if you really understand the two righteousness, righteous by law, dead end, righteousness by faith is where I would argue we need to be. It also, then, to wrap up this night, it also gives me a little bit, okay, I have value, and I am important, and I am made for something epic and great. Not in a look at me kind of way, but in the soldier kind of way, like, wow, I am lifted to something much higher than me, something very divine. And by the way, put that in the back of your mind. That'll save your marriage someday. Seriously. Okay? Anything else? I'll stick around, but I think we're kind of sort of up at our time, right? Yeah. I think that's what you said. So I'm willing to stick around here, but whatever you guys want to do. So thank you.